It is the 20th of April 1968. In the British city of Birmingham, members of the Conservative Party file into a meeting to hear a speech made by a local MP, the Shadow Secretary of Defence. Minutes tick by and the anticipation grows in the unusually large crowd, but then the man enters the room and begins to speak. The subject is that of immigration and integration. "As I look ahead," he says, "I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." The next day, the leader of the Conservative Party, Edward Heath, sacks the MP from the shadow cabinet for giving a speech which many see as being inflammatory, but others see as being prophetic. The man's name? Enoch Powell, the prophet of a divided Britain. The man known to history as Enoch Powell was born on the 16th of June 1912 at Flaxley Lane in the Stetchford area of the city of Birmingham in the English Midlands. His full baptismal name was John Enoch Powell. His father was Albert Enoch Powell, the headmaster of the local primary school. His family originally hailed from Radnorshire in mid-Wales. The Powells had gravitated over the border to Birmingham in England as part of the migration towards the industrial cities from traditionally agricultural communities in 19th century Britain. Enoch's older ancestors had worked in the coal mining industry and as iron workers, and his longer family background was working class, even though his father's profession marked the Powells out as middle class in the 20th century. Enoch's mother was Ellen Mary. Her maiden name was Breeze, and she came originally from Liverpool, a city on the northwest coast of England. She married Albert in 1909 when she was in her early 20s, and he was nearing his late 30s. Enoch was their only child. They used the name Jack for him when he was growing up. Enoch grew up in a household where his education was the center of family life. Not only was his father a teacher and schoolmaster, his mother had also briefly been a teacher. She gave up her job when her only child was born, and thereafter Enoch also became her sole pupil. As soon as he could start learning to read, she put up cards around the Powell family home that showed the letters of the alphabet so that he could learn more quickly, and he was soon beginning to read beyond his age. His mother proved to be a major influence on his development in this way throughout his youth. For instance, when he was a teenager, she began teaching him to read Greek, a subject which, along with Latin, was still taught fairly extensively in schools in Britain in an age when the ancient Greek and Roman classics were more revered than they are today. Through his mother's teaching, his father's input, and his own initiative, Enoch won a scholarship to begin attending a prestigious secondary school in Birmingham in 1925. He flourished there and was soon regarded as a promising scholar in the making. He had an aptitude for more than just books as well, and became a keen musician, specializing in playing the clarinet. To get a sense of exactly how accomplished Powell was as a young man, consider the following. By the time he finished his secondary education, and before he went to university, he was already working on producing his own translation from the original Greek of the Histories of Herodotus, the ancient Greek account of the Persian-Greek Wars, considered to be the first work of historical writing in the Western tradition. He would publish his edition of Herodotus and several further commentaries on the histories in the 1930s and 1940s. For him to have been working on his own translation of the text as a teenager was highly unusual. His early aptitude for the classics and excellent school performance earned him a place at Trinity College, Cambridge, where he headed in 1930. It was a difficult time in Britain's history, as the effects of the Great Depression began to take hold across the country. At Cambridge, Powell studied the classics and ended his 3 years of study in 1933 with a first-class honours. He was a brilliant undergraduate scholar, and by the time he was 20, he was already submitting pieces to academic journals for consideration for publication. While his earliest work had been in translating Herodotus and other texts, he branched out to begin examining old papyrus texts from the Greek world, work which would result in the publication in 1936 of an edition of papyri collected decades earlier by the Cambridge biblical scholar J. Rendell Harris. Harris collected old manuscripts of early Christian writings and biblical texts, like the fragments of the non-canonical Gospels that didn't make it into the New Testament. There were dozens of these non-canonical Gospels which remain relatively understudied to this day. Powell edited some of these texts that Harris had gathered and published them. At the same time, he still found time to concentrate on the Greek and Roman classics and began work on a translation of the history of the Peloponnesian War by Herodotus's contemporary Thucydides. He would publish an edition of this as well in the 1940s. He also improved his abilities in French, Italian, and German, read and studied widely, and won numerous scholarly prizes at Cambridge. At the same time, he was something of a loner and wrote poetry as an emotional outlet. He had an early fascination with German culture and was dismayed at the rise of the Nazis to power in Germany in 1933 and the book burnings that began not long afterwards. One of his German heroes was the philosopher and philologist Friedrich Nietzsche. Powell had hoped to emulate Nietzsche by acquiring a professorship at a university by the age of 24, but he only managed to do so at 25 years of age, slightly later than the German. Moreover, Powell had to travel to the other side of the world to acquire a posting, to the University of Sydney. He arrived there early in 1938 as a professor of Greek. Powell had made a dramatic statement to the Vice-Chancellor of his new university when he arrived in Australia by stating that Britain would soon be at war with Germany, and when this happened, Powell intended to head home to Europe to help fight the Nazis. His statement was entirely accurate. Within weeks, news was being heard in Australia of the annexation of Austria by Germany. Then, in September 1938, came the Munich Conference, followed by the failure of appeasement, the annexation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, and the outbreak of the Second World War, when the Nazis invaded Poland in September of that year. Britain had declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September. Powell boarded a ship in Sydney bound for his homeland the next day. He arrived home as the phony war was underway, a long period of half a year during which nothing much happened in the war. After Poland was conquered in September and October 1939 by the Germans, they didn't move again until April 1940, when they quickly absorbed Denmark and Norway into the expanding Third Reich. Powell was in Britain attempting to gain a posting as a frontline soldier, perhaps to join the British Expeditionary Force in France. He had no luck in realizing this ambition. The military took one look at the long list of languages he could speak and his educational accomplishments and decided he was going to spend the war behind a desk, not with a gun in his hands. Translators and administrators were needed, much to his frustration. He didn't remain in Britain, though. In 1941, as the centre of British wartime activity switched to North Africa, he was posted to Cairo and played a role in organising various parts of the campaign in Egypt. He obtained the rank of Lieutenant General in the summer of 1942. In November 1942, Operation Torch saw the Western Allies invade Morocco and Algeria nearly a year after the United States had entered the war. In January 1943, one of the first major conferences of Allied leaders took place at Casablanca in Morocco, with Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt present. Powell attended as a British staff officer in Africa. He was already beginning to develop the idea that the US would seek to replace Britain as the preeminent global superpower after the war. It was the start of Powell's lifelong antipathy towards the role of the Americans in the post-war world. His views in this regard were shaped by the fact that Powell was a British imperialist and pined for the days when Britain was at the peak of its powers in the late 19th century. His glorification of empire ensured that he was delighted to gain a posting to India as the campaign in North Africa wound down in Allied victory in the late spring of 1943. He was in the city of Delhi by August 1943. Here, the enemy was the Empire of Japan. Although they were starting to suffer serious defeats to the Americans and the islands of the Western Pacific, the Japanese were still on the offensive in the India-Burma region and were threatening to push on westwards towards Kolkata. Over the next 2 years, Powell was involved in planning the campaign as part of the army staff in Delhi. He repeatedly sought to be allowed to serve on the front, but his requests were denied. His disappointment was dampened by the fact that he genuinely enjoyed being in India and absorbed as much of the country's culture as he could during wartime. Unsurprisingly, given his immense abilities as a linguist, he learned to read Urdu and began reading some of the classics of Indian literature in the original language. By the time the war in Europe came to an end in May 1945, the strategic planning in India, beyond completing the campaign to retake Singapore from the Japanese, was turning to the post-war situation in India itself. Promises had been made to the people of the British Raj concerning independence in return for their aid in the war effort. The government would try to put it off for as long as possible, though there was no doubt independence was coming before too long. There were also hundreds of thousands of troops to be demobilized, many of them ill from tropical diseases. Therefore, a lot of the work which Powell and his fellow officers were carrying out in 1945 was actually planning for the post-war situation in India. He was promoted to the rank of brigadier in the middle of this, and once the fighting against the Japanese wound down in the autumn, he was offered a senior military administrative position in peacetime India. Powell turned it down. He had formed an ambition while in India to become the viceroy of the British Raj and believed that if he went home and started a political career, his academic understanding of elements of Indian culture could help him to achieve his goal. He was therefore stunned back in England to see British rule collapse in India within just 2 years of the war ending, and then a descent into chaotic and bloody partition between Hindu India and Muslim Pakistan. It was only the beginning of Britain's post-war retreat from empire. At the same time as India was being granted its independence, the British oversight of the mandated territory in the Levant, which it had overseen since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, also came to an end. Calls were being heard all over Africa for independence from British, French, Belgian, Portuguese, and Spanish rule. Rebellions were seen in places like Kenya that the British ruled, and by the end of the 1950s, after the humiliation of the Suez Crisis of 1956, the British began to also unwind their empire in Africa. Powell commenced his political career at a time when his personal life was also undergoing a lot of change. His emotional life in his teenage years and his 20s had been limited in a way. He had prioritized his academic work at Cambridge and afterwards in Australia. Then, his late 20s and early 30s were dominated by the war. Back in England, he seems to have realized he should marry and start a family. He soon began seeing a woman named Margaret Pamela Wilson. She worked as an administrator for the Conservative Party that Powell was rising within in the post-war era, and they soon married on the 2nd of January 1952. Wilson was 25 years old. Powell was nearing his 40th birthday. His family life would provide him with the stability he had sought for many years, which allowed him to dedicate himself to his work in a more structured way. He and Pamela had 2 daughters. Susan was born in 1954 and Jennifer 2 years later in 1956. Another change for Enoch at this time was his reconversion in 1949 to Christianity. He had been raised in a Christian household, but he became a pretty militant atheist as a young man at Cambridge. His readoption of the religion of his parents came about as a result of an experience while he was walking home in Wolverhampton one evening in 1949. Powell had an inclination to enter a nearby church, the first time he had been inside one in 15 years, and described it as a solemn experience which led to a spiritual awakening. While his marriage and his religion were uncontroversial, a theory has emerged that Powell was bisexual. He did have a number of very close male relationships during his youth at Cambridge, and he did express his love for other men in writing and in conversation with others. Furthermore, his female relationships were limited and strained in his youth, and this, combined with his late marriage when he was nearly 40, has fueled speculation that he was gay. However, the evidence is inconclusive, and his statements about his male friends at Cambridge and elsewhere could be explained as expressions of firm friendship. Powell's marriage to Pamela would not have occurred had he not joined the Conservative Party in Britain after he returned from India and started a political career. His first move within the party was to stand to become an MP in a by-election held in the constituency of Normanton in Yorkshire in February 1947. This was a Labour Party working-class heartland, and Powell never stood a chance. A year later, the Conservatives decided that he would stand in the constituency of Wolverhampton South West, near his native Birmingham, when the next general election was held. As a result, Powell had 2 years to begin establishing a presence in Wolverhampton and to build up his support base. It paid off in the end. When the next election was held in February 1950, Powell defeated the Labour Party incumbent Billy Hughes by a narrow margin of 46 to 44.4%. As a first-time MP entering the House of Commons, Powell soon established himself as a significant backbencher with his own independent views. He joined with Ian MacLeod and other Conservative MPs as part of the group of One Nation Conservatives whose views harked back to the political philosophy espoused by Benjamin Disraeli as Prime Minister of Britain in the 19th century. Powell opposed British entry into the emerging European coal and steel community, the forerunner of today's European Union, and advocated strongly for free markets worldwide instead. When the Labour Party government called a snap election in October 1951 to shore up its support, Powell was re-elected for Wolverhampton South West. Incumbency helped him, and this time he won a comfortable victory with 54% of the vote. The leader of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, had hoped that by calling fresh elections in 1951 he would strengthen his hand in Parliament. The election did not go as planned, though. The Labour Party won the most votes, but managed to lose the election as Winston Churchill's Conservatives won more seats despite getting fewer votes. Churchill consequently returned as Prime Minister at 76 years of age. Powell was disappointed that he was not offered a ministry of some kind and turned down a junior position within the Home Office where he would have been in charge of elements of Welsh policy. He was probably getting ahead of himself here. He'd only been an MP for a couple of years, and it made sense to appoint a man with Welsh heritage and who could read and write the Welsh language to a Welsh position. Powell held out for something more senior. He finally received it after fresh elections in 1955 brought Churchill's successor as head of the Conservatives, Anthony Eden, to power. Within a few months, Powell was appointed as a parliamentary secretary to the Housing Minister Duncan Sands, a post which effectively made him a junior minister for housing. He performed admirably enough as Sands' deputy in 1956 that in 1957 he was promoted again to the position of Financial Secretary to the Treasury. This was the most important position within the government below that of a full ministerial office. He was influential over the next 2 years in convincing the government that they needed to get a handle on post-war inflation, and Powell was the driving force behind increasing lending rates from 5% to 7% in the late 1950s. He also urged financial stringency and pushed for government spending to be cut back after the post-war Labour administrations from 1945 to 1951 had increased spending to establish the welfare state. Powell's relatively rapid political ascent in the 1950s, from becoming a first-time MP in 1950 to obtaining a junior ministry in the middle of the decade and then exerting a sizable influence over economic policy from 1957 onwards, was rooted in his abilities as a public speaker. Enoch Powell was many things, and he became an immensely divisive figure in post-war British politics. However, absolutely nobody at the time debated his abilities as a speaker in Parliament. He had honed his craft as a lecturer before the war, and he was able to deliver his speeches in a fluid manner that was deeply aware of British history and constitutional politics. It was as though he first arrived into Parliament in the 1950s as an accomplished MP already. Powell himself would later claim that the best speech he ever gave in the House of Commons was on the Royal Titles Bill in 1953, just 3 years into his time in Parliament. This was over what might have seemed like a fairly pedantic issue to many people, the question of whether Queen Elizabeth II, who had succeeded her father King George VI a year earlier, should be referred to as ruling over a realm or realms. Powell argued that the change was meaningless, but his arguments were actually in favour of the idea that the monarchy still ruled over a major empire that spanned the globe. This was part of Powell's wider appeal as a politician over the years. He was someone who was unrepentant about Britain's imperial past and thought that the memory of it should be celebrated. Beyond his abilities as a speaker, Powell also used his pen to generate support and to spread his ideas. In 1954, he was the main driving force amongst the One Nation Tories behind the publication of a pamphlet entitled "Change is Our Ally," which argued for a more free market economy and a retreat from the planned economy which Labour had pioneered since 1945. He would frequently publish policy papers like this throughout his parliamentary career. Powell would become synonymous with numerous speeches that he gave during his lifetime. One of the earliest ones that has become quite famous was the Holla Massacre speech. Back in 1952, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, better known as the Mau Mau, had launched an armed insurrection against British rule in Kenya. The most intense period of the Mau Mau rebellion occurred between 1952 and 1956. Elements of it continued down to 1960, and there continued to be prison camps operated by the colonial government to house rebels and recalcitrant elements. One of these in the south of Kenya was the Holla camp. About 500 prisoners were being held here by 1959. Holla was divided into 2 camps, one being for more difficult prisoners who often would not obey orders. Here, 88 prisoners were identified in the spring of 1959 as being particularly difficult to deal with. A more brutal enforcement policy was adopted to have these people carry out manual labour. In early March, this policy resulted in 11 Kenyan prisoners being clubbed to death. When news of the Holla Camp massacre reached Britain, Powell gave one of his most memorable speeches in the House of Commons. Here, he stated that Britain could not, quote, have African standards in Africa, Asian standards in Asia, and British standards here at home. He went on to assert that British rules of law needed to be enforced just as much in the colonies as in London. If it was unacceptable for prison guards to kill prisoners in a British prison, then it was unacceptable to do so in Kenya. The Holla Camp speech earned Powell admirers even amongst the Labour Party and the Liberals, and suggests that, despite later assertions to the contrary, he was not a racist. Here he was clearly saying that one's race was no excuse for brutality. It was also clear from this and other speeches which he gave at the time that Powell had largely accepted Britain's retreat from empire in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis of 1956, and his focus was now on strengthening Britain's position in a post-colonial world order. Powell delivered the Holla Massacre speech a few months before fresh elections in the UK in October 1959. The Conservatives won a resounding victory that gave their leader, Harold Macmillan a substantial mandate. Powell was rewarded for his work in the 1950s with his first full ministerial cabinet position, Minister of Health. He spent 3 years in this position, during which he attempted a number of substantial reforms. First, he wanted to shift the focus of the National Health Service away from a growing managerial emphasis to focus on patient care, a struggle which has characterized virtually every healthcare service in the developed world since the Second World War. Secondly, he sought to expand its activities by building new hospitals, a program of work which he announced in 1962. He was also tasked with handling the thalidomide controversy. This was a drug which had been developed as a treatment for morning sickness in pregnant women and which resulted in birth defects. By the time Powell became Minister of Health, the dangers were apparent. He oversaw a public awareness campaign which advised British families to check their medicine cabinets and throw the drug out. There were other initiatives which Powell led, which it seems incredible that they still needed to be carried out as late as the 1960s. This included shutting down some of the Victorian-era insane asylums in England that employed methods which were completely out of sync with modern psychology. Powell's reform program was ultimately curtailed as he resigned from his position after a change in the Conservative Party leadership brought Alec Douglas Hume, whom Powell had campaigned against, to power in October 1963. Powell returned to the backbenches after stepping down as Minister of Health late in 1963. He would never occupy a senior ministerial position ever again. This does not mean that his influence on British politics was at an end. Indeed, he stood for election to become the new leader of the Conservative Party when a leadership contest was held in 1965, the first time the party had held an open leadership election of this kind. Douglas Hume's short tenure as leader of the Conservatives had come to an end after the party was defeated in the 1964 elections and Harold Wilson led Labour back into government. In the ensuing Conservative Party leadership race, Powell came third with just 5% of the vote. Edward Heath became the new leader of the Tories. Aware of Powell's support base within a certain faction of the party, Heath offered his rival any position he wanted within the shadow cabinet. Much to many people's surprise, Powell elected to take up the defence portfolio. Most observers had speculated that he would choose to take on the shadow finance portfolio, a move which would have opened the way for him to become the Chancellor of the Exchequer one day in the future when the Conservatives returned to power. Powell chose the defence portfolio because he had developed views on British defence priorities that were in keeping with his anti-American outlook on the global order. He wanted Britain to focus to a much greater extent on its defence priorities in Europe rather than seeking to continue funding international bases around the world. He was also critical of a proposal which had emerged in the mid-1960s for the British to send troops to aid the United States in its doomed conflict in Vietnam. His opposition was one of the reasons why Britain refrained from doing so. Powell's time as the shadow spokesperson on defence could have seen him become the actual Minister for Defence in the 1970s when the Conservatives returned to power, had it not been for a massive controversy which erupted surrounding him in 1968. This concerned the issue of immigration into Britain. When Powell was born in the early 20th century, England was still a country which was populated overwhelmingly by white people of British ancestry. London was a cosmopolitan centre of empire and had a large community of foreigners, while each of the large industrial cities of England did have minority communities, particularly of migrants from Ireland, but also other countries in Europe. This situation began to change quickly after the Second World War. Countries like the United Kingdom, France and Germany had lost hundreds of thousands or even millions of young men in the war, and they had to address severe labour shortages to rebuild their devastated economies. Germany would turn to émigré guest workers from Turkey to fill the gap. Britain and France turned to their overseas empires. By the late 1940s, large numbers of economic migrants from the British colonies in the Caribbean were immigrating to England to help with rebuilding the country. Later, this migration extended to the former countries of the British Raj, and many Indian and Pakistani people began coming to England and even parts of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. By the 1960s, some cities had particular areas that had become hubs of migrant settlement, notably Brixton in London, while the English Midlands urban conurbation, which included Birmingham and Wolverhampton, where Powell sat as an MP, was emerging as one of the main hubs of Afro-Caribbean, Indian and Pakistani settlement in England. Powell watched on as this demographic shift was occurring in his native city and the nearby constituency that he represented. In 1968, he decided to make a statement on it, which is one of the most infamous speeches ever given in post-war British politics. Powell's intervention on the migration issue in 1968 is known as the Rivers of Blood speech. He delivered it on the 20th of April 1968 at a local meeting of Conservative Party members in Birmingham. There is no denying that it was controversial. In it, he suggested that he was regularly approached by constituents in Wolverhampton who believed they had no future in England because the country was going to be taken over by migrant families arriving from the Commonwealth nations that Britain had ruled in decades gone by. Powell stated, quote, "We must be mad, literally mad, as a nation to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents who are, for the most part, the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population." Powell went on to predict potential violence in England if the trend wasn't reversed. Drawing on his past as a classical scholar, he paraphrased a section from the Aeneid, written by the Roman epic poet Virgil, stating, quote, "As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." It is from this section of his speech that the name the Rivers of Blood speech derives. Undoubtedly, it was all controversial. Powell knew full well that it would be, and had told several people he knew in the days leading up to the speech that he was about to do something that would cause quite a stir. That being said, it wasn't entirely unexpected. He had been expressing his opposition to migration policies since 1948 and had argued consistently that allowing extensive migration from former colonies made little sense when those same nations were now gaining their independence from Britain. Powell's decision to deliver the Rivers of Blood speech was triggered by a debate at the time in England over the Race Relations Act, legislation which sought to make it illegal to refuse employment, housing or services to people on the basis of their race or skin colour. The issue of race relations was consequently on many people's minds at the time. It soon became clear that Powell's views were not exactly opposed by a broad majority of the British population. Polls were carried out in the days and weeks after his speech, and these revealed that roughly 3/4 of the country agreed that migration was an issue. Powell's constituency and parliamentary officers received over 100,000 letters of support. One person who didn't or couldn't support him was the leader of the Conservative Party, Edward Heath. Tensions had already been growing between Heath and Powell since 1965, and as the controversy exploded in the hours after Powell delivered his speech, Heath conferred with other members of the shadow cabinet and then rang Powell to dismiss him from his position as Shadow Defence Minister. He would never return to frontline politics within the Conservative Party. Of course, there has been an ocean of commentary written over the years about whether or not Powell's speech was racist or not. Many individuals accused him of being racist at the time, and for years afterwards there was certainly a strand of anti-migration xenophobia involved in it. In contrast, Powell had previously demonstrated his admiration of Indian culture when he was stationed there during the war, and had defended the rights of Kenyan subjects in Africa at the time of the Hola Massacre speech in 1959. Some defend the speech as one focused solely on migration policy rather than racism, though Powell was no doubt aware how inflammatory his speech would be perceived as being, especially so when he referred to the river Tiber foaming with blood. Indeed, later in his life, in an attempt to explain his beliefs on immigration, Powell said that England should be England and India should be India. In the aftermath of his dismissal by Heath, Powell was free to express himself in whatever way he wished. Provided he didn't commit any crime or flagrant abuse of Conservative Party rules, he was free to continue as an MP while sitting on the back benches. He took advantage of this situation and used his position as the newfound contrarian of British politics to try to influence policy without ever aspiring to power. An example of this was the so-called Morecambe budget. In the autumn of 1968, 6 months after the Rivers of Blood speech, Powell put forward an alternative to the government budget of the Labour Party that year. It was, and still is, normal for opposition parties in countries like Britain to put forward alternative budgets to the government so that voters can get a sense of what the opposition would do economically if they were in power. Usually, this is carried out by the opposition spokesperson or shadow minister for finance. Powell decided in an unorthodox step to produce his own alternative budget ideas and delivered them during a speech he gave at Morecambe in Lancashire on the 11th of October 1968. The Morecambe budget was neoliberal in its approach before neoliberalism had ever become fashionable in the Western world. He proposed slashing income taxation in half to a basic rate of 21%. This would be financed through a drastic reduction of the state to cut all foreign aid, huge amounts of the welfare state, and the privatization of many national industries. A program of public works would conversely be initiated by borrowing money instead of acquiring it through taxation. Powell had no influence within Heath's Conservative Party by this time, and as a result, his ideas were ignored by the party establishment. Nevertheless, it is important to note that what he proposed in the late 1960s was the basic outline of the economic policy adopted by Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister of Britain in the 1980s. Another major issue which Powell was engaging with by the end of the 1960s was proposed reform of the House of Lords. Parliaments in nearly every Western democracy are divided into two houses, an upper and a lower house. The lower house in Britain was the House of Commons, and had originally emerged in medieval times to represent the gentry and rich urban elites. The upper house was the House of Lords, and was originally filled by aristocrats and ecclesiastical lords like bishops and archbishops. Over time, however, the nature of the British Parliament changed to where the House of Commons became all-powerful, and the House of Lords was increasingly just a body that rubber-stamped legislation decided upon by the elected members of the lower house. This differs from the US system, where the Senate and the House of Representatives are both directly elected branches of Congress and play an equal role in policy formation. In the 1960s, there were plans to reform the UK House of Lords to make it more elective. Powell was vehemently opposed to this and led opposition to the reform initiative. He claimed there was really no need to reform the upper house to make it more democratic because it didn't really play any role in deciding on legislation anyway. That was determined by the House of Commons and the government of the day, and reforming the House of Lords to make it more democratic would only confuse the issue. Perhaps Powell was right. One need only look at the manner in which the Senate and the House of Representatives in the United States can block legislation if they are controlled by different parties to see that having an equally powerful upper and lower house can lead to legislative gridlock. In any event, Powell managed as a backbencher to have the reform measures killed. It was arguably his greatest tangible success as an MP. While his opposition to the reform of the House of Lords was a short-lived success story for Powell, the issue which he has probably been most influential over in modern British politics was British membership of what had started in the 1950s as the European Coal and Steel Community. Britain had been too proud of its imperial past and aloofness from the continent to join France, Italy, West Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg when the project began, or once it became, the European Economic Community following the signing of the Treaty of Rome in 1957. However, by the 1960s it was very clear that Britain was falling well behind those countries that had joined the EEC in terms of its economic performance. As early as 1961, the UK was applying to join the EEC. Its applications were rejected owing to the interference of the French President Charles de Gaulle, while sentiment at home in Britain remained mixed about the idea. De Gaulle resigned for the final time as French leader in April 1969, and the issue of British membership of the EEC resurfaced. Powell became a vocal opponent of the idea both within the Conservative Party and in the House of Commons. Critics pointed out that he had been a cabinet minister in the early 1960s when Harold Macmillan had tried to join the EEC, and that he had not expressed any objections at that time. To this, Powell responded that back in the early 1960s, he had viewed membership of the EEC as simply a way of gaining entry into the common market for the sale of goods between member states, and that this was in line with his belief in free trade. However, by the late 1960s, he claimed he viewed the EEC as moving towards creating a European supranational state, one in which Britain's sovereignty would be compromised by European institutions in Brussels, Luxembourg, Strasbourg, and Frankfurt. Britain would ultimately join the EEC in 1973, but the objections that Powell raised as early as 1969 persisted throughout Britain's nearly half-a-century-long membership of the European project and were central to the decision to leave the bloc in recent times. While his views on economic policy, migration, and membership of what is now the European Union are the policy issues which Powell has become synonymous with, there were other elements to what many people began identifying as Powellism in the 1970s, a certain political outlook synonymous with the man. In the private sphere, he held the view that the state should play a minimal role in people's lives and followed the policy advocated for by the Labour Party, known as the permissive society. For instance, this meant that he took a relaxed view on the issue of divorce, which was still a controversial topic at the time. Powell was clear that matters of marriage were up to the individual and not the government to decide on. He held the same view when it came to homosexuality, which was illegal in England and Wales until 1967 and until 1980, north of the border in Scotland. Powell stated that the idea of criminalising sexuality, whether one agreed with what another person did or not, was an example of the state overstepping its area of jurisdiction. In all of this, Powell was what would be called a libertarian in American politics, a person who believed that when it comes to matters of personal choice, that they should be left to the individual to decide on for themselves, as long as they do not impact on the freedoms of anyone else. He was also opposed to the death penalty and advocated for a more humane prison system. These considerably more modern views aside, Powell was a traditionalist when it came to the monarchy, the preservation of the House of Lords as a seat of hereditary peers, and the primacy of the Anglican Church of England within the religious life of the country. By the early 1970s, it was clear that Powell had no real future within the Conservative Party. There was no possibility that he would be rehabilitated by Heath and brought back to a ministerial position. In fact, he was drifting further away from the party establishment, if anything. A major breach came over the party's attitude towards Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland had been created as a separate entity within the United Kingdom back in 1921, while the Irish War of Independence was underway in Ireland. It comprised just 6 of the 32 counties of Ireland. The rest of Ireland became independent, and Northern Ireland was ruled by a separate unionist parliament at Stormont outside the city of Belfast for the next half a century. In the 1960s, a civil rights campaign to guarantee equal rights for Roman Catholics in the province had expanded into a war between the unionist government and Republican armed groups like the Irish Republican Army. In 1972, Heath's government announced that it was suspending the Stormont Parliament in Northern Ireland and would henceforth rule Northern Ireland from London while the violence continued in Northern Ireland. Powell nearly resigned at this point from the Conservatives. In the end, he waited until early 1974. He spent the last 2 years of his time as a Conservative backbencher as a perennial thorn in Heath's side, criticising everything from economic policy as stagflation, a combination of economic stagnation and inflation was setting in, to the decision to take in a large number of Ugandan refugees after the rise to power of the dictator Idi Amin there. The economic crisis of 1973, wrought by the spike in global oil prices, made Heath's position more difficult. Powell took pleasure in actively campaigning against his own party leader when elections were called for February 1974. He was more than happy when the elections resulted in the first hung parliament in 45 years. Heath tried to form a minority government, only to be outflanked by Harold Wilson, who formed a minority Labour government after winning the most seats. Heath would remain on as leader of the Conservative Party for a few more months before he was ultimately replaced by Margaret Thatcher. She would never have to deal with Powell as a dissenting voice from within her own party. Wilson's Labour minority government only lasted a few months, and fresh elections were held in October 1974. When they were, Powell did not stand as a Conservative Party candidate. He had been approached by the Ulster Unionist Party, who favoured him on account of his opposition to the end of devolved government at Stormont. Powell thus stood as a candidate for the Ulster Unionist Party in 1974. The peculiar nature of the British electoral system, where candidates can stand for election in constituencies they have no real ties to of any kind, meant that Powell was able to win a seat running in the constituency of South Down, a rural part of Northern Ireland along the border with the Republic. Powell benefited from the fact that while he had no familial or personal ties to South Down, he was a very publicly recognised unionist who was in favour of a strong devolved government at Stormont. The fact that direct rule had been imposed in 1972 meant that he took up his position at Westminster as an MP. The wider election result had seen Wilson's Labour win 319 seats out of 635. This meant that they had a razor-thin majority and lost by-elections between 1974 and 1979 meant they had to rely on non-party support. Powell was important during the Parliament in convincing the Ulster Unionist Party to support Labour on occasion in return for concessions to the Unionist cause. This was a new approach for the Unionists, who had always viewed the Conservatives as their natural allies within wider British politics. Throughout all of these years, even as he worked as a prominent MP and politician within the Conservative Party and the Unionists, Powell continued to write and publish extensively. He never fully left academia, even after he left the university. Most of his published output in the 1930s and 1940s had focused on his translations of and commentary on the histories written by Herodotus and Thucydides. Powell also busied himself learning the Welsh of his ancestors in his youth, and during the war he co-authored a book on traditional native Cymric law. His published work thereafter between the 1950s and 1980s points to his breadth of learning and interests. Much of it focused on policy matters, and Powell wrote about things like economic policy and housing in line with his party positions as a Tory at various points. At the same time, he was interested in the history of Parliament and wrote several histories of England's Parliament over the centuries. For instance, in 1968, he published a book entitled The House of Lords in the Middle Ages, which was considered an important contribution to an understudied subject at the time. A decade later, he published a biographical history of Joseph Chamberlain, a leading British statesman of the late 19th century who is often overshadowed today by the role his son played in appeasing Hitler in the late 1930s. He also published poetry, notably an edition entitled Dancer's End and the Wedding Gift, that appeared in 1951. Powell's last book, published when he was in his mid-80s and in the twilight of his life, was a study on the evolution of the Christian Gospels, a work which returned to the same territory as his first book on the Rendell-Harris papyri, published back in 1936, bringing his academic work full circle over a 60-year period. The irony of Powell's departure from the Conservative Party and his shift to join the Ulster Unionist Party in 1974 was that a whole slew of the measures he had been arguing for nearly a quarter of a century were about to be adopted as the official policy of the Conservatives under Margaret Thatcher. She later admitted fairly openly that her economic policies were derived from Powell's advocacy of free markets, lower taxes, a smaller government, and the denationalisation of public services and industries. After Thatcher eventually led the Conservatives back into government in 1979, she began implementing these policies. Hence, Powell, for someone who only briefly held the office of Minister of Health for a few years in the early 1960s and left the Tories in 1974, was a strangely powerful influence on how they acted in government throughout the 1980s. His relationship with Thatcher was complex. He expressed pessimistic views when she won the election in 1979. She was considerably more sympathetic towards him and stated her admiration for him on several occasions. They were different in several ways, though. Powell's British nationalism was more rooted in the past. He lionised Britain's medieval history and its time as the leading superpower of the world in the 19th century. Thatcher admired all of that, but she was of a slightly younger generation, and her worldview was informed more by post-war politics than the Victorian age. Where this led to a sharp divergence between them was over the United States. Thatcher formed a close alliance with the President of the US during her time, Ronald Reagan. Powell's lifelong antipathy to US involvement in Europe's affairs was well known. Conversely, Powell was an admirer of German culture, where Thatcher viewed the Germans as Britain's economic rival in Europe. On membership of the EEC, Powell was a steadfast critic from the late 1960s. Thatcher shifted her position. She became more sceptical as the possibility of a unified Germany materialized at the end of the 1980s. Despite his early reservations concerning her rise to power, Powell soon warmed to Thatcher in government. One of the things which led to this was her handling of the Falklands War. The conflict came about following attempts by the military junta of Argentina to claim control over the Falkland Islands and South Georgia in the South Atlantic in the spring of 1982. The government in Buenos Aires had believed that the British would not respond to this naked act of aggression, as the islands involved were so thinly inhabited and far away. This was not the case. Thatcher responded with a robust military operation which defeated the Argentine occupation within a matter of weeks in the early summer of 1982. Powell encouraged Thatcher to act aggressively from the beginning of the crisis. When she did act resolutely, Powell became complimentary, and as the war went on he met with her and was even provided with government information which was not in the public domain about the crisis. Hence, for a brief period, between 1982 and 1985, there was a repairing of relations between Powell and the Conservative Party leadership. Perhaps he might even have returned to the party had it not been for the developing situation in Northern Ireland. There, the British government had entered into talks with the government of the Republic of Ireland to try and find a working solution to the ongoing terrorist campaigns being engaged in by both Republicans and Unionists. For hardline Unionist political groups, like the Ulster Unionist Party, this was difficult to accept, and when a political agreement was struck between Thatcher's government and that of Garret FitzGerald, the Taoiseach of Ireland, in 1985, the cordial relationship between Powell and Thatcher collapsed once again. For a figure who occupied a very substantial place within post-war British politics, Powell's parliamentary career did not come to an end in a voluntary manner. He ran for re-election when elections were held again in 1987. Powell was possibly hurt by his opposition to the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, which had sought to work out a pathway towards peace in Northern Ireland. He was defeated by Eddie McGrady, the candidate for the Social Democratic and Labour Party, a moderate Republican party in Northern Ireland. With this, Powell's 37 years as an MP came to an end. By then, he was in his mid-70s and would not seek re-election again at a future date. Those who knew him stated that he was privately distraught at the loss and for a time did not know what to do now that his political career was at an end. As a former cabinet member, he was offered a life peerage and a seat in the House of Lords. However, Powell's public opposition to life peerages as opposed to hereditary peerages was well known, and he declined a life peerage in 1987 after concluding that it would be viewed as rank hypocrisy for him to benefit from something he had campaigned against 30 years earlier. Instead, he returned to writing and publishing. Much of this focused on religious topics in his last years, while he also produced more poetry. He never left political commentary entirely and wrote for the newspapers and gave public talks regularly. In 1994, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Despite his ailing health, he contributed to a documentary on his life and work that appeared in 1995. He was appalled by the election of the new Labour government of Tony Blair in 1997 and believed it could lead to the breaking up of the United Kingdom if it took a loose approach towards devolution of power to Scotland and Wales. His final illness came early in 1998. Admitted to King Edward VII's Hospital in London, he died there on the 8th of February 1998 at 85 years of age. Powell was given a military burial in Warwickshire. Within hours of Powell's death, prominent individuals were offering commentary on his legacy and his controversial position within post-war British life. The serving Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair, put it succinctly when he said that, quote, "However controversial his views, he was one of the great figures of 20th century British politics, gifted with a brilliant mind." Margaret Thatcher, who was herself long in retirement at that point, stated that there will never be anybody else so compelling as Enoch Powell. He was magnetic. Listening to his speeches was an unforgettable privilege. As recently as 2017, Kenneth Clarke, one of the foremost politicians of late 20th century British politics, noted that Powell had been the greatest orator in the post-war British Parliament. It is remarkable that Powell engendered so much commentary immediately after he died and ever since, as he never rose to a position of seniority in British politics. His highest station was as Minister for Health for 3 years in the early 1960s, and he never held one of the 4 great offices of state in Britain. And yet, his influence on British politics had been considerable. Powellism is understood today as a strand of British post-war political ideology. The views espoused by Powell, a strong belief in free market economics, a traditional view of Britain as an imperial power, and a simultaneous commitment of a strong union of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and a particular outlook on British life are all features of it. Powellism will always be connected as well with a stance on immigration and on Britain's involvement with what has since become the European Union. In these spheres, Powell continues to influence British politics and society. There is a direct line between his political outlook and Britain's exit from the European Union in modern times. Enoch Powell was a controversial character both in his own time and ever since. Yet, while many people might have disagreed with his views on public policy for Britain, there is no denying that he was an accomplished man in many ways. In his early years, he embarked on a career in academia and established himself as a classical scholar of considerable reputation. He would continue throughout his life to write and publish on a wide range of matters, from books on the father of history, Herodotus, to the functioning of the House of Lords in medieval times, and from policy documents on housing and economics to grander statements on the nature of one-nation conservatism. While his output as a writer and historian was considerable, he is primarily known today for his political career and his exceptional speaking abilities in the House of Commons. Powell began life as a Tory and finished it as an Ulster Unionist. Above all, he walked his own path when it came to deciding his views on a range of policy matters. Many of his interventions in British politics were obviously controversial, particularly his opposition to immigration and the "rivers of blood" speech. What is perhaps most interesting about Powell is that he expressed views that often did not fit easily into the perception of him as a Tory or someone on either the left or right of the political spectrum. For instance, his views on sexuality, marriage, and other issues fell firmly within the liberal end of the political spectrum. Powell believed these were personal matters that should be left to individuals to decide upon themselves. In this sense, Powellism was a British form of libertarianism. That same libertarian streak was the cause of his objection to British entry into the EEC and his eventual departure from the Conservative benches in Parliament. His legacy in British politics is long and complicated. No other individual who never held one of the great offices of state in Britain has been as influential in shaping the country's modern politics. What do you think of Enoch Powell? Was his career ultimately a failure, or did he achieve success indirectly through the adoption of large swathes of Powellism by the Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.